The camera opens on a child's small hand, blue with cold, reaching through falling snow toward a dying light. Some storms don't just bring wind and ice, they bring reckonings. Cut to a man's weathered hands gripping a wrench, then releasing it as he hears a sound that will change everything. In a world where power devours the innocent and money silences truth, sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes it takes a man who has lost everything to fight for someone who still has something left to lose. The sound of expensive car engines cutting through a blizzard, shadows moving with purpose. A little girl's whispered confession. I wasn't really lost. They say the meek shall inherit the earth, but first, they have to survive those who would steal it from them. Lightning illuminates a courthouse. Legal documents scatter like leaves in a hurricane. A man's voice, cold with certainty. I have evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and intentional child endangerment. This is the story of a storm that brought three souls together and the war that nearly tore them apart. When the powerful prey on the powerless, heroes aren't born, they're forged. The wind howled through Cedar Falls like a banshee seeking vengeance, carrying ice crystals that bit into exposed skin with the ferocity of 1,000 needles. November in Iowa was unforgiving, but this storm was something else entirely, a meteorological monster that had meteorologists reaching for words like historic and unprecedented. The temperature had plummeted to -20, and the wind chill made it feel like the surface of an alien planet. Marcus Williams pulled his worn leather jacket tighter around his broad frame as he stepped out of Williams Auto Repair, the harsh fluorescent lights inside casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow-covered parking lot. At 48, he moved with the deliberate, economical grace of a man who had learned that rushing through life only led to heartbreak and regret. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who had seen too much, lost too much, and spent the last 3 years trying to forget just how much. The garage had been his sanctuary since the day he'd arrived in Cedar Falls with nothing but a broken heart and a determination to disappear from the world that had taken everything he loved. Before that dark chapter, he'd been Marcus Williams, senior design engineer at Ford's Advanced Powertrain Division, holder of 17 patents, and the kind of man who wore $1,000 suits to work and drove cars that purred with German precision instead of growling with American muscle. But that Marcus had died on a snowy night 3 years ago, buried under an avalanche of grief so overwhelming it had crushed everything he used to be. The successful engineer, the devoted husband, the proud father, all of it had vanished in the twisted metal of a highway accident that had stolen his wife Sarah and 15-year-old son Danny in one horrific instant. Now he was just the guy who fixed broken-down pickup trucks and changed oil in rusted sedans that smelled of hard work and harder lives. Most days, that was enough. Most days. The simple satisfaction of taking something broken and making it whole again filled the hollow spaces where his heart used to beat with purpose. The rhythmic clang of his tools, the honest smell of motor oil and metal shavings, the quiet pride of bringing a dead engine back to life. These things had become his meditation, his therapy, his reason for getting up each morning. Tonight wasn't most days. The storm had been building all afternoon, starting as a gentle snowfall that had gradually transformed into something biblical. By the time Marcus locked up at 9 p.m., Cedar Falls looked like a town abandoned by God himself. Main Street, usually bustling with the comfortable activity of small-town life, was deserted except for the occasional snowplow, scraping its way through the mounting drifts with the determination of a soldier fighting a losing battle. The local radio had been broadcasting warnings all day: stay indoors, avoid unnecessary travel, check on elderly neighbors, the kind of storm that killed the unprepared, the unlucky, the forgotten. Marcus had lived through enough Iowa winters to respect that kind of cold, the kind that could stop a man's heart in minutes if he wasn't careful. He was halfway to his battered Ford F-150, a truck that had seen better decades but still ran with the stubborn reliability of American steel when he heard it. A sound so faint he almost missed it over the banshee wail of the wind. A whimper, soft and desperate, carried on the Arctic air like a prayer no one was meant to hear. Marcus stopped dead in his tracks, his boots crunching in the snow that was already ankle-deep and rising. He strained to listen, his breath forming clouds of vapor that were snatched away by the wind before they could fully form. The sound came again. Definitely human, definitely small, definitely in trouble. "Hello," he called out, his voice nearly swallowed by the storm. "Someone there?" For a moment, there was nothing but the wind. Then, from the alley beside his garage, a tiny figure emerged from behind the dumpster like a ghost materializing from the darkness. Marcus's heart nearly stopped beating. It was a little girl, maybe 7 years old, dressed in a thin pink coat that was no match for an Iowa winter, let alone this Arctic nightmare. Her blonde hair was matted with snow and ice, her lips blue with hypothermia, and her small body shook so violently Marcus could see the tremors from 20 feet away. She looked like something out of a nightmare, a child abandoned to the elements, forgotten by the world. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, the words torn from his chest like a physical wound. Every dormant paternal instinct he possessed exploded into action. Muscle memory from the years when he'd been a father, when protecting the innocent had been as natural as breathing. He rushed toward her, his boots slipping on the ice, his heart hammering against his ribs with a terror he hadn't felt since the night the police had knocked on his door. "Hey there, sweetheart, what are you doing out here?" The child looked up at him with enormous green eyes that held depths of fear and exhaustion no 7-year-old should ever carry. She tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering too hard to form words. Her small body racked with shivers that spoke of how close she was to the edge of something irreversible. Marcus didn't hesitate. Training from his army days kicked in assess, act, survive. He scooped her up in his arms, feeling how light she was, how her small body radiated cold through her pathetically inadequate clothing, like a block of ice wrapped in cotton. She was barely conscious, her green eyes unfocused and glassy with the early stages of hypothermia. "We need to get you warm, right now," he said, more to himself than to her, already moving toward the garage with long, urgent strides. Back inside Williams Auto Repair, Marcus cranked the space heater to maximum and began the careful process of warming a hypothermic child. He learned basic medical training in the Army, and he remembered enough to know that warming someone too quickly could be as dangerous as the cold itself. He wrapped her in every blanket he could find, moving blankets from his restoration projects, the old quilt his mother had made him years ago, even his own jacket. She sat on the old leather couch in his office, still shivering but gradually returning to the land of the living, while he rummaged through his emergency supplies for hot chocolate mix and anything else that might help. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked gently, kneeling in front of her with a steaming mug wrapped in a towel so she wouldn't burn her frozen fingers. "Sophie," she whispered, her voice barely audible, like the whisper of wind through autumn leaves. "That's a beautiful name," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from her, but maintaining careful distance so she wouldn't feel trapped or threatened. "I'm Marcus. You're safe now." "Okay. Nobody's going to hurt you here." He handed her the mug, watching as she wrapped her small fingers around it with the desperate gratitude of someone who understood how close she'd come to never being warm again. The sight of her, this tiny, fragile thing who had somehow survived in conditions that could kill a grown man, made something twist painfully in Marcus's chest. "Sophie, where are your parents? Where do you live?" The question seemed to hit her like a physical blow. Her green eyes filled with tears that she tried desperately to hold back, and she stared into the hot chocolate as if the answers to all of life's mysteries might be floating there among the marshmallows. "I can't go back," she whispered, and there was something in her tone of bone-deep desperation, a fear that went beyond the physical that made Marcus's blood run cold. He'd heard that same note in his own voice 3 years ago, when the well-meaning grief counselors had tried to tell him that time would heal his wounds, that life would go on, that he needed to process his loss and move forward. The sound of someone whose world had shattered so completely that the pieces could never be put back together. Okay, he said softly, recognizing that pushing would only drive her deeper into whatever hell she was carrying. You don't have to go anywhere tonight. You're safe here. Sophie, I promise. And so Marcus Williams, who had spent 3 years avoiding human connection like it was a contagious disease, found himself sitting up all night watching over a frightened little girl, wondering how the hell he was going to handle this situation come morning, and trying to ignore the way her presence was already starting to crack the walls he'd built around his heart. Every hour, he checked on her, adjusting blankets, taking her temperature with an old thermometer from his first aid kit, making sure she was breathing steadily. By 4 a.m., her shivering had stopped and some color had returned to her cheeks, but she still looked fragile as spun glass. As dawn approached, Marcus found himself thinking about Danny, his son, who would have been 18 now, who had been passionate about engineering and cars and making the world a better place. Danny, who had died too young, too suddenly, leaving behind dreams that would never be fulfilled, and a father who had forgotten how to believe in tomorrow. Watching Sophie sleep, seeing the trust in her peaceful expression, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the desire to protect someone other than himself. It was terrifying and overwhelming and completely unwelcome, but it was also undeniably real. He had no idea that this was only the beginning, that by the time the sun rose over Cedar Falls, his carefully ordered world of solitude and emotional numbness would be turned upside down by forces he couldn't control and wouldn't understand until it was far too late to turn back. Dawn brought no relief from the storm, but it did bring visitors that would change everything. Marcus had dozed fitfully in his desk chair, jerking awake every hour to check on Sophie, who had finally fallen into the deep, exhausted sleep of someone who had pushed their small body beyond all reasonable limits. Around 6 a.m., he'd managed to coax her awake long enough to drink some orange juice and eat a few crackers, but she'd said almost nothing, just watched him with those enormous green eyes that seemed to hold secrets too heavy for a 7-year-old to carry. He was making coffee, real coffee, not the usual instant sludge he survived on when the sound of expensive engines cut through the wind outside like knives through silk. The storm was still raging, but these vehicles moved with the confidence of machines that cost more than most people's houses and came equipped with enough technology to navigate a lunar landing. Through the frost-covered window of his office, Marcus watched 3 vehicles pull into his lot with military precision: a black Mercedes S-Class that gleamed like polished obsidian, a silver Porsche Cayenne that looked like it belonged on a racetrack rather than Iowa backroads, and a white BMW X7 that probably had more computer power than the space shuttle. The sight was surreal, these monuments to wealth and power parked next to his humble garage like something out of a fever dream. In Cedar Falls, a luxury vehicle was usually a Ford F-150 with working air conditioning and fewer than 200,000 miles on the odometer. These cars belonged in Manhattan or Beverly Hills, not in a small Iowa town where the biggest excitement was usually the Friday night high school football game. The Mercedes door opened first, and out stepped a woman who commanded attention like a force of nature. Even from a distance, Marcus could see that she was in her early 40s, with platinum blonde hair pulled into a severe bun that spoke of absolute control and discipline. She wore a tailored black coat that probably cost more than Marcus made in 3 months, and moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. But it was her eyes that caught his attention, ice blue and sharp as laser beams, scanning the scene with the calculated precision of a general surveying a battlefield. This was a woman who was used to being the smartest person in the room, used to getting what she wanted, used to having her orders followed without question. She marched toward the garage like she owned not just the building, but the entire town, her heels clicking sharply against the icy pavement, despite conditions that would have sent most people sprawling. The sound was rhythmic, authoritative, the percussion of power in motion. The 2 other vehicles disgorged what looked like security personnel, serious men in dark suits who moved with the fluid economy of former military or law enforcement. They flanked her at a respectful distance, alert but not obviously threatening, The kind of protection that whispered rather than shouted about the importance of the person they were guarding. Marcus glanced back at Sophie, who was awake now and watching the approaching entourage with an expression he couldn't quite read. Fear, recognition, something else entirely. Her small hands clutched the blanket he'd wrapped around her, and he could see tension creeping back into her small frame. "Sophie," he said quietly, "do you know who that is?" She nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's my mom." Marcus felt the pieces of the puzzle click into place with the finality of a lock closing. This was Sophie's mother, the polished, powerful woman whose 7-year-old daughter had been wandering the streets in a blizzard that could have killed her. His protective instincts, already running at full throttle, kicked into overdrive. He stepped outside to meet this approaching storm of wealth and authority, pulling the door closed behind him to give Sophie a few more moments of safety. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he barely noticed. His attention was focused entirely on the woman walking toward him with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. "Are you Marcus Williams?" she asked, her voice crisp and commanding, carrying easily over the wind. She was beautiful in an intimidating way, all sharp edges and controlled power. But there was something else lurking beneath the surface, something desperate and raw that she was trying very hard to hide. "Depends who's asking," Marcus replied, crossing his arms over his chest and adopting the neutral stance he'd perfected during his years of dealing with difficult customers and demanding executives. "My name is Victoria Sterling." The name was delivered like a title, as if he should recognize it, as if it carried weight and meaning beyond the simple combination of syllables. "I believe you have my daughter." The words hit Marcus like a slap. Not "I'm looking for my daughter," or "Have you seen my daughter," but "You have my daughter." As if Sophie were a possession that had been temporarily misplaced rather than a terrified child who had nearly died in the storm. "Sophie's inside," he said carefully, his voice neutral but his eyes hard. "She's safe." For just a moment, Victoria's composure cracked, revealing a flash of genuine relief so intense it was almost painful to witness. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and she closed her eyes as if offering a prayer of thanksgiving to whatever deity protected lost children and desperate mothers. "Thank God," she breathed, and in those two words, Marcus heard the echo of a night spent in hell, searching for a missing child while imagining every possible horrible outcome. "I've been looking all night. When I couldn't find her." She took a deep breath, visibly rebuilding the walls that kept her vulnerability hidden from the world. When she opened her eyes again, the moment of weakness was gone, replaced by the mask of control that was apparently her default setting. "May I see her?" she asked, and there was something in her tone, not quite a request, not quite a demand, but something in between that suggested she wasn't used to having to ask permission for anything. Marcus studied her for a long moment, trying to reconcile the polished executive in front of him with the fact that her daughter had been wandering the streets alone in a blizzard. Everything about Victoria Sterling screamed wealth and success, but there was something off about the whole situation. Rich kids with attentive parents didn't usually end up freezing to death in small-town Iowa. "She's been through hell," he said finally, his voice carrying a warning that was barely disguised. "Might want to take it slow." Something flickered in Victoria's eyes, surprise, maybe, or annoyance at being told what to do by a small-town mechanic. But she nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his words, even if she didn't like the source. "Of course," she said, her voice softer than it had been outside. "I wouldn't want to frighten her." Inside the garage, Sophie was sitting exactly where Marcus had left her, wrapped in blankets and watching the door with the focused intensity of a small animal, waiting to see if the approaching footsteps belonged to friend or foe. When she saw Victoria, she didn't run into her mother's arms with the joyful relief that should have marked the end of this ordeal. Instead, she pressed closer to Marcus, her small hand gripping his jacket with the desperate strength of someone clinging to a life preserver in a storm. The gesture was small but devastating, speaking volumes about the relationship between mother and daughter. "Sophie, sweetheart," Victoria said, her voice carefully modulated to project warmth and concern. But Marcus could hear the artificial note in it, the sound of someone performing emotion rather than feeling it. I was so worried. Are you hurt? Sophie shook her head, but didn't move away from Marcus's protective presence. The silence stretched uncomfortably, filled with all the things that weren't being said, all the questions that hung in the air, like smoke from a fire no one wanted to acknowledge. Victoria's phone buzzed, the sound sharp and intrusive in the quiet garage. She glanced at it reflexively, and Marcus saw her jaw tighten as she read whatever message had appeared on the screen. We need to go, she said, the maternal warmth evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. I have a conference call in an hour with investors from Singapore. They're only available for a narrow window, and this deal is worth... She stopped mid-sentence, perhaps realizing how that sounded. But the damage was already done. Marcus felt his temper rise like mercury in a thermometer, but he kept his voice level. Maybe Sophie should rest a bit more, he suggested, his tone carefully neutral. She's been through a trauma. Victoria's eyes snapped to his, and for a moment, he saw the real woman beneath the corporate armor, exhausted, struggling, and drowning in responsibilities she didn't know how to balance. But there was also something else, something almost defensive, as if she was used to having her parenting questioned and had developed thick skin about it. Mr. Williams, she said carefully, I appreciate what you've done for Sophie. More than you know, but she needs to come home now. Do you, Marcus asked and looking down at Sophie, want to go home? It was a simple question, but it carried enormous weight. Sophie looked up at him with those serious green eyes, then at her mother, then back at him. Her small hand tightened on his jacket, and that was answer enough. Victoria's phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. She glanced at it with barely concealed frustration, and Marcus could see the internal battle playing out across her features, duty to her child versus duty to her business, motherhood versus the demands of a world that waited for no one. When she looked back up, Marcus saw something he hadn't expected: vulnerability. Raw, honest vulnerability that she probably didn't let many people see. Mr. Williams, she said quietly, could we talk privately? They stepped into Marcus's small office, leaving Sophie with one of Victoria's security guards who, despite his intimidating appearance, seemed to have a gentle way with children. Marcus had noticed the man's eyes soften when he looked at Sophie, the way he'd automatically lowered himself to her height when introducing himself. Former military, probably, maybe with kids of his own. I don't know what she told you, Victoria began, then stopped, running a perfectly manicured hand over her face in a gesture that was purely human, completely at odds with her polished exterior. I'm not good at this. The mother thing. Marcus waited, sensing there was more coming, recognizing the sound of someone standing on the edge of a confession they weren't sure they were ready to make. Sophie's father and I divorced 2 years ago, Victoria continued, her voice barely above a whisper. It was ugly, very public, very messy. Since then, she's been angry, distant. I thought if I just worked harder, made more money, I could give her everything she needed. The best schools, the best clothes, the best opportunities. Her voice trailed off, and Marcus could hear the unspoken end of that sentence. But none of it was enough. When's the last time you just sat with her? Marcus asked gently. No phones, no meetings, no agenda. Just sat. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice was so soft he almost didn't hear it. I can't remember. The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge across a chasm, connecting two worlds that had seemed impossibly far apart just moments before. Marcus saw this powerful woman who seemed to have everything and recognized the same kind of loss he'd been carrying for 3 years, the loss of connection, of purpose, of the ability to believe that love was something you could trust. She's not pulling away because she doesn't love you, Marcus said quietly. She's pulling away because she thinks you don't love her. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away, but not before Marcus saw them. In that moment, the corporate executive disappeared, and all that was left was a mother who was drowning and didn't know how to ask for help. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, and there was genuine desperation in her voice. "I have a company to run, hundreds of employees depending on me, deals worth millions of dollars that can't be delayed. I can't just—" "What good is all that if you lose her?" Marcus interrupted, the words carrying more weight than he'd intended. The question hit Victoria like a physical blow. She stared at him, and Marcus saw the exact moment when her carefully constructed world began to crack, when the foundation she'd built her life on revealed itself to be made of sand rather than stone. "I don't know how to be what she needs," Victoria whispered, and in those words, Marcus heard an echo of his own struggles, his own failures, his own desperate desire to be better than he was. Marcus felt an unexpected surge of sympathy. This woman, who seemed to have everything he'd lost: success, money, a child who was still alive and breathing, was drowning in her own way, struggling with the same fundamental question that had haunted him for 3 years. How do you love someone when you're not sure you remember how? "Then maybe it's time to learn," he said simply. Victoria looked at him with something approaching wonder, as if the idea that she could change, could become something different than what she was, had never occurred to her before. "Would you—" she started, then stopped, clearly struggling with something. "Would you help me, Sophie, trust you? Maybe if you were there, if you could show me—" The request hit Marcus like a freight train. Getting involved meant opening himself up to caring again, to the possibility of loss, to all the things he'd sworn he'd never risk again. He'd built his entire life around the principle of emotional self-preservation, and this woman was asking him to tear down those walls and step back into the world of connection and vulnerability. But then he thought of Sophie's small hand in his, the way she'd looked at him with such desperate trust, the sound of her voice when she'd whispered, "I can't go back." He thought of Danny, of all the children in the world who needed someone to stand up for them, to fight for them, to care enough to get involved even when it was dangerous. "Okay," he said quietly, sealing both their fates with a single word. "I'll help." What Marcus didn't know was that this simple agreement would change all their lives in ways none of them could imagine, setting in motion a chain of events that would test everything they thought they knew about love, family, and the price of second chances. Victoria's relief was palpable, but there was something else in her eyes, a flicker of hope that she was trying very hard not to acknowledge, as if hoping for something better was a luxury she couldn't afford, a risk too great to take. "Thank you," she said simply, and in those two words, Marcus heard the beginning of something that would either save them all or destroy them completely. He just wasn't sure which. 3 days after the storm, Marcus found himself in a position he'd never imagined, sitting in the passenger seat of a Mercedes S-Class, being driven through the wealthy suburbs of Des Moines toward a world that might as well have been on another planet. Victoria had called him the morning after Sophie's rescue, her voice carrying a note of determination that hadn't been there before. "Sophie wants to see you," she'd said simply, "and I think I need to see how you do it. Do what? Connect with her? Make her feel safe?" There had been a pause. Then, make her smile. Now, as they pulled through wrought iron gates that probably cost more than Marcus's entire garage, he was beginning to understand the magnitude of the world Sophie lived in. The Sterling estate was massive, a sprawling Tudor revival mansion that looked like something out of Architectural Digest, complete with perfectly manicured lawns, topiary gardens, and a circular driveway large enough to host a car show. "Impressive," Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral. Victoria glanced at him, perhaps trying to gauge whether there was judgment in his tone. "It was Richard's choice," she said quietly. "My ex-husband. He said we needed to project success. That image was everything in business. And now it feels like a museum, beautiful, expensive, and completely empty of anything that matters." The honesty in her voice surprised him. Victoria had been different since their conversation in his garage, less polished, more real, as if she'd decided to stop performing and start being human. It was a subtle change, but Marcus noticed the way she moved differently, spoke differently, as if she'd removed some invisible armor that had been weighing her down. Inside the house, Sophie came running down a grand staircase that belonged in a palace, her small feet barely making a sound on the polished marble. She launched herself into Marcus's arms with the kind of unrestrained joy that made his chest tight with emotion he'd thought was long dead. "Marcus, you came," her voice echoed in the cavernous foyer, bouncing off walls that were decorated with expensive art and empty of any sign of actual family life. "Hey there, kiddo," he said, swinging her around in a circle that made her giggle. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Mom let me stay home from school today, and we made pancakes together." Sophie's excitement was infectious, but Marcus noticed the way Victoria watched them interact. As if she were studying a foreign language she desperately wanted to learn. "You made pancakes?" Marcus looked at Victoria with raised eyebrows. "Actual cooking," Victoria smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "Well, Sophie made them. I mostly supervised and tried not to burn down the kitchen." They spent the afternoon in Sophie's playroom, a space that was larger than Marcus's entire apartment, and filled with enough toys to stock a small store. But what struck him most was how Sophie interacted with all these expensive possessions. She played with them, but there was no real joy in it, no sense of attachment or ownership. They were just objects filling space in her life. What she really wanted was attention. When Marcus sat on the floor and asked her to show him her favorite book, her whole face lit up. When he really listened to her elaborate explanation of the dollhouse drama she'd created, she blossomed like a flower turning toward the sun. Victoria watched from the doorway, taking mental notes on every interaction. Marcus could see her analyzing, trying to decode the secret of connection she'd somehow missed. But when he caught her eye and gestured for her to join them, she hesitated. "I don't want to interrupt," she said. "Sophie?" Marcus said. "Why don't you show your mom that story you were telling me about the princess and the dragon?" For a moment, Sophie looked uncertain, as if she wasn't sure her mother would be interested. But Victoria settled onto the floor beside them, expensive skirt and all, and gave Sophie her complete attention. "Tell me about the princess," she said. And Marcus heard something in her voice he hadn't heard before, genuine curiosity about her daughter's inner world. What followed was magical. Sophie, encouraged by her mother's attention, launched into an elaborate tale involving a brave princess, a misunderstood dragon, and a kingdom that needed saving. Victoria listened with the focused intensity she probably brought to million-dollar business deals, asking questions and making suggestions that showed she was really hearing what Sophie was saying. For the first time, Marcus saw the family they could be, but as the afternoon wore on, he also began to notice things that didn't quite add up. Like the way Victoria's phone rang constantly, but she kept letting it go to voicemail with increasingly worried glances, or how she mentioned needing to talk to the accountants with a tension in her voice that spoke of more than routine business matters. Most telling was a brief conversation he overheard when Victoria stepped out to take a call she couldn't ignore. Her voice was low, but in the marble-floored house, sound carried. "I understand the timeline, but I need more time." "No, I can't liquidate that asset yet. Carol, I'm trying to hold this together, but I need you to buy me another week." When she returned, her smile was bright but forced, and Marcus began to suspect that Victoria Sterling's perfect life might not be as perfect as it appeared. The revelation came a week later, during what had become a regular Thursday afternoon visit. Marcus was helping Sophie build an elaborate blanket fort in the living room, much to the horror of the housekeeper, who clearly wasn't used to seeing furniture rearranged for the purposes of childhood imagination. Victoria was in her home office, fielding what sounded like increasingly frantic phone calls, and Sophie had grown quiet as the afternoon wore on. Marcus noticed the change in her demeanor, the way she'd stopped chattering about her school day and started arranging the stuffed animals in the fort with mechanical precision. "Hey," he said gently, settling beside her in the blanket cave they'd created. "You okay, kiddo?" Sophie was quiet for a long moment, her small fingers whirring at the edge of her favorite blanket, a worn pink thing that looked completely out of place among all the expensive designer furnishings. "Marcus," she said finally, her voice so soft he had to lean in to hear her. "Yeah, can I tell you a secret?" Something in her tone made Marcus's chest tighten. "Of course, Sophie, you can tell me anything." She was quiet for another long moment, and when she spoke, her words shattered everything Marcus thought he understood about that night in the storm. "I wasn't really lost," she whispered. "That night when you found me, I wasn't lost." Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I ran away." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them inside for so long they'd built up pressure like steam in a kettle. "I planned it for weeks. I took some food from the kitchen, and I found that place behind your building. And I waited for a really bad storm so Mom wouldn't look for me right away." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. This wasn't the story of a child who had wandered off and gotten lost. This was the story of a 7-year-old who had deliberately put herself in mortal danger rather than stay in her own home. "Sophie," he said carefully, "why would you do something so dangerous?" Her green eyes filled with tears she was trying desperately not to shed. "Because I wanted to find someone who would actually want me around." The words hit Marcus like a knife to the chest. He thought of that night, of finding her nearly frozen to death, and realized that she had been willing to die rather than continue living in a house where she felt unwanted. "Oh, sweetheart," he breathed, pulling her into his arms. She came willingly, burying her face against his shoulder as the tears she'd been holding back finally broke free. "I thought maybe if I disappeared, Mom would notice I was gone," she sobbed. "But then I got so cold, and I was so scared, and I thought I was going to die. And then you found me, and you were nice to me, and you didn't act like I was bothering you." Marcus held her while she cried, his own eyes burning with tears he couldn't shed. This beautiful, intelligent, loving child had been so starved for attention that she'd been willing to risk everything just to feel wanted by someone. "Sophie, listen to me," he said when her sobs had quieted to hiccups. "You are wanted. You are loved. And what you did was incredibly dangerous. But I understand why you did it." She pulled back to look at him, her face streaked with tears. "You do. Sometimes when we're hurting, we do things that don't make sense to anyone else. But Sophie, you never have to risk your life to get attention. You never have to earn love. It should be given freely, just because you exist. But Mom doesn't." "Your mom loves you more than anything in this world," Marcus said firmly. "She's just forgotten how to show it. But she's learning. We're all learning." Sophie nodded slowly, but Marcus could see the doubt in her eyes. A 7-year-old's trust, once broken, was not easily repaired. When Victoria finished her phone call and found them in the blanket fort, Sophie was curled against Marcus's side, emotionally exhausted, but finally at peace. Victoria took one look at the scene and knew immediately that something significant had happened. "Everything okay?" she asked, settling beside them. Marcus met her eyes over Sophie's head. "We need to talk." Later, after Sophie had fallen asleep in the fort and been carried to her bed, Marcus told Victoria everything. He watched her face cycle through disbelief, horror, and finally a grief so profound it was painful to witness. "She ran away," Victoria whispered, sitting in her pristine living room with her head in her hands. "My baby girl was so desperate to feel loved that she was willing to die rather than stay here with me." "Victoria, what kind of monster does that make me?" Her voice broke completely. "What kind of mother fails so completely that her child would rather freeze to death than—" "Stop!" Marcus's voice was firm enough to cut through her self-recrimination. "You're not a monster. You're a woman who got so caught up in providing for your daughter that you forgot she needed you more than she needed anything you could buy her." Victoria looked at him with eyes full of tears. How do I fix this? How do I undo that kind of damage? The same way you fix anything else, Marcus said simply. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of real connection at a time. Victoria nodded slowly, and Marcus saw something change in her expression, a resolution, a determination that went deeper than any business decision she'd ever made. I'm going to do better, she said quietly. I have to do better. She deserves so much more than what I've been giving her. Yes, Marcus agreed. She does, and so do you. That night, as Marcus drove home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, he realized that he'd crossed a line he'd sworn he'd never cross again. He was emotionally invested in these two people, connected to their story in a way that made him vulnerable to loss all over again. But for the first time in 3 years, that didn't terrify him as much as it should have. What he didn't know was that forces were already moving against them, that enemies were gathering in the shadows, and that the fragile new family they were building was about to face challenges that would test everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the price of happiness. 2 weeks into their tentative partnership, Marcus began to notice the cracks in Victoria's perfect facade. They were small things at first, the way she hesitated before suggesting dinner at an expensive restaurant, as if calculating costs in her head. The way her smile grew tight when Sophie asked for new art supplies. The increasingly frantic nature of the phone calls she thought no one could hear. The truth came crashing down on a gray Thursday afternoon in early December. Marcus had arrived at the Sterling estate for his weekly visit with Sophie. But instead of the usual warm greeting, he was met by Carol Martinez, Victoria's assistant, whose normally professional demeanor was cracking under obvious strain. She's in her office, Carol said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that immediately put Marcus on alert. The accountants are here. It's not good. Marcus found Victoria in her home office, staring out at the winter landscape with the hollow expression of someone watching their world burn. Financial documents were scattered across her antique desk like the debris of an explosion, and her usually perfect composure was nowhere to be found. Victoria, he said softly from the doorway. She turned, and Marcus was shocked by what he saw. This was a woman on the edge of complete collapse, all her careful control finally cracking under pressure that had apparently been building for months. Her eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and unshed tears. Her usually immaculate hair was disheveled, and her hands shook slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. Marcus, her voice was flat, defeated, carrying none of the warmth or determination he'd grown accustomed to hearing. You're early. What's going on? For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. That, like a dam finally giving way under too much pressure, everything poured out in a torrent of desperate honesty. I'm broke, she said simply, the words falling into the room like stones into still water. Or close enough to make no difference. The company's hemorrhaging money has been for months. I've been selling everything I own just to keep the doors open and my employees paid. Marcus stared at her, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed finally clicking into place. The cars, the clothes, this house. Leased, borrowed, bought on credit I can't afford. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it, only the bitter sound of someone who had run out of options. Even this office, I'm 3 months behind on the mortgage. She stood and walked to the window with jerky, mechanical movements, like a marionette being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, coating the perfectly manicured grounds in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and pristine and utterly false. I built Sterling Properties from nothing, she continued, her voice hollow with exhaustion. Scraped and clawed my way up from a trailer park in Tulsa to this, she gestured at the opulent office around them. And now it's all falling apart. Marcus processed this information, understanding now why Sophie had felt so neglected, why Victoria always seemed stressed and distracted, why there was an underlying current of desperation beneath her polished exterior. What happened? He asked gently. Victoria pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window. Bad investments. A development deal in California that went south when the environmental impact studies came back negative. A business partner who embezzled $500,000 before disappearing to somewhere without an extradition treaty. Her breath fogged the glass as she spoke. But mostly, it was me. I was so focused on proving I could succeed in a man's world, so determined to build something that could never be taken away from me, that I stopped paying attention to the details that actually mattered. She turned back to face him, and Marcus saw something in her eyes that he recognized from his own darkest moments, the look of someone who had lost everything they thought defined them. "How bad is it?" he asked. "Bad enough that I might lose everything by Christmas?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The company, this house, Sophie's private school, the trust fund I set up for her college." Victoria's voice cracked. "I've already had to let most of my staff go. Carol's working for free because she believes in me more than I believe in myself right now." She sank into her chair, suddenly looking older than her 42 years. "I wanted to give Sophie everything. Marcus, I wanted to make sure she never had to worry about money the way I did growing up. Instead, I'm going to lose her." Marcus felt something inside him crack open, the same something that had responded to Sophie's desperate trust, that had driven him to help despite all his resolutions to stay uninvolved. This woman, who had seemed so untouchable, so perfectly in control, was drowning. And despite all his walls and defenses, he couldn't just watch her go under. "There has to be something we can do," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Victoria shook her head. "I've tried everything. Emergency loans, private investors, selling assets. No one wants to touch a failing real estate company in this market, especially one run by a woman who's apparently in over her head." Marcus walked to her desk, studying the financial documents scattered across its surface with the same analytical mind that had once solved complex engineering problems for one of the world's largest automotive companies. Years of project management and strategic planning had taught him to see patterns where others saw only chaos, to find solutions where others saw only problems. "What about restructuring?" he asked, his mind already working through possibilities. "Cutting overhead, focusing on smaller projects with faster turnaround." "I've thought of that," Victoria said listlessly, "but I don't have the expertise to pull off that kind of overhaul, and I can't afford to hire someone who does." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then made a decision that would change everything for all of them. "What if you didn't have to hire someone?" Victoria stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "What are you talking about?" Marcus sat down heavily in the chair across from her desk, running his hands through his graying hair. This was a story he'd never told anyone in Cedar Falls, a past he'd buried so deep he sometimes forgot it existed himself. "Before I came here," he began slowly, each word feeling like he was excavating pieces of a life that belonged to someone else. "I wasn't just a mechanic. I was Marcus Williams, senior design engineer at Ford Motor Company," he continued, watching Victoria's eyes widen with surprise. "I held 17 patents for hybrid and electric vehicle systems, managed a team of 40 engineers, and made more money in a year than most people see in a lifetime." Victoria's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She was staring at him as if seeing him for the first time, trying to reconcile the image of the quiet, small-town mechanic with the high-powered executive he was describing. "What happened?" she asked softly. The familiar weight of grief settled on Marcus's chest like an old, unwelcome friend. "Life happened. My wife Sarah was a corporate attorney for a firm in Detroit. My son Danny was 15. Brilliant. Wanted to be an engineer like his old man. We had everything: big house in Dearborn, vacation home on Lake Michigan, plans for Danny's MIT application." Marcus stopped, his throat closing around words he'd spoken to no one in 3 years. The memories were as sharp as broken glass, cutting him even as he tried to handle them carefully. "There was an accident," he managed finally. "Black ice on I-94, a semi jackknifed. and they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I lost them both in an instant. Sarah died on impact. Danny lived long enough for me to say goodbye. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Marcus, I'm so sorry. I tried to go back to work, but everything reminded me of them. The house where Danny had built his first robot, the lab where I'd been developing the hybrid system he was so excited about, the future we'd planned together. Marcus's voice trailed off, so I walked away from all of it. Sold the house, donated half my money to a children's engineering scholarship fund, and ended up here fixing cars because working with my hands was the only thing that didn't make me want to put my fist through a wall. But you still have the knowledge, Victoria said quietly. The business experience, the technical expertise. Marcus nodded. 15 years of project management, cost analysis, strategic planning, and systems engineering. I know how to take something broken and figure out how to make it work again, whether it's an engine or a business. He met her eyes. The question is, do you trust me enough to let me try? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to read the truth written there in the lines of grief and hard-won wisdom. When she spoke, her voice was firm despite the tears still glistening in her eyes. What do you need for the next 8 hours? They worked. Marcus spread Victoria's financial documents across the conference table in her office, creating a comprehensive map of her company's problems and potential solutions. It was like solving a complex engineering puzzle, finding the critical points where small changes could create massive improvements in efficiency and profitability. Your overhead is killing you, he said, pointing to a column of numbers that made his engineer's brain itch. This downtown office alone costs more per month than my garage makes in a year. And for what clients don't choose real estate developers based on how expensive their offices are. But image is everything in commercial real estate, Victoria protested. Clients expect a certain level of sophistication. They need to see success before they'll trust you with their investments. Clients expect results, Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years managing multi-million-dollar projects. They don't care if you're working out of a renovated warehouse as long as you can deliver what they need on time and under budget. He pulled up a spreadsheet on Victoria's laptop, his fingers flying over the keys with the confidence of someone who'd done this analysis countless times before. Numbers flowed across the screen: expense projections, revenue forecasts, cash flow analyses that painted a clear picture of what needed to happen. Look, he said, turning the screen so Victoria could see the projected savings. If we move operations to a smaller space, something industrial, practical, maybe with a workshop where you can show clients actual renovation work in progress, and cut the administrative staff down to just Carol and maybe one assistant, we can reduce your monthly overhead by 70%. Victoria leaned over his shoulder to study the numbers, her breath warm against his cheek as she focused on the screen. That could work, she said slowly. But I'd need startup capital for inventory, materials, contractor deposits, at least $200,000 to get the new model operational. How much? $200,000 minimum, maybe more depending on how quickly we want to scale up. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his mind racing through possibilities. Then he reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in over 2 years. The conversation was brief, professional, conducted in the kind of technical shorthand that spoke of years of shared experience and mutual respect. When Marcus hung up, Victoria was staring at him with barely contained curiosity. Who was that? She asked. My old boss at Ford, Marcus said, unable to keep a slight smile from tugging at the corners of his mouth. Turns out they've been looking for someone to manage their real estate portfolio expansion in the Midwest. New manufacturing facilities, supplier relationships, community development projects. Victoria's eyes widened. And when they want Sterling Properties to consult on site selection and community impact assessment for their next 3 facilities, 6-month contract with bonuses tied to timeline performance. Marcus's smile grew wider. Base fee is $300,000, plus potential bonuses that could double that if you hit their efficiency targets. For a moment, Victoria just stared at him, her mouth slightly open in shock. Then she did something Marcus hadn't seen since the day he'd found Sophie in the storm. She smiled, really smiled, with genuine joy and hope, and the kind of fierce determination that had probably carried her from that trailer park in Tulsa to the boardrooms of Des Moines. "You did this for me," she said wonderingly, as if the concept of someone going out of their way to help her was completely foreign. "I did it for Sophie," Marcus replied automatically, then caught himself. "But also for you. You don't deserve to lose everything because you were trying to build something better for your daughter." Victoria stood and walked around the desk to where Marcus sat. Without warning, she leaned down and kissed his cheek, her lips soft and warm against his skin. The gesture was simple, innocent, but it sent an electric shock through Marcus's system that had nothing to do with the business arrangement they'd just discussed. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you for this." Marcus felt something stir in his chest, something he'd thought was dead and buried in the rubble of his old life. For the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for second chances, not just for Victoria and Sophie, but for him as well. "Just be happy," he said quietly. "That's payment enough." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something much bigger than a business turnaround. There were forces at work here that none of them fully understood, connections forming that would be tested in ways they couldn't imagine. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that happiness was a fragile thing, and that some people would do anything to destroy it rather than let others possess what they themselves had lost. Over the next month, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Victoria closed her expensive downtown office and moved Sterling Properties to a renovated warehouse space on the outskirts of Des Moines, a cavernous building with exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and enormous windows that flooded the space with natural light. Marcus worked alongside her 16 hours a day, applying the same systematic approach that had made him successful at Ford to the challenge of rebuilding her company from the ground up. They developed new business plans, streamlined operational procedures, and created a client presentation system that emphasized practical results over corporate flash. But more importantly, Victoria was finally learning to be a mother. She picked Sophie up from school every day, helped with homework at the kitchen table instead of in a formal study, and actually listened when her daughter talked about her friends, her fears, her dreams. The change in Sophie was immediate and profound. The scared, desperate child Marcus had found in the storm was blossoming into a confident, happy little girl who laughed easily and hugged freely. Marcus found himself drawn deeper into their lives with each passing day, becoming not just a business advisor, but a friend, a surrogate father figure to Sophie, and something to Victoria that he was still afraid to name. The walls he'd built around his heart were crumbling stone by stone, and despite his lingering fears about loss and vulnerability, he found he didn't want to stop the process. It was perfect. It was beautiful. It was everything none of them had dared to hope for, which was exactly why Marcus should have known it couldn't last. The attack came on a Tuesday morning in mid-December, swift and devastating as a lightning strike designed to destroy everything they'd built. Marcus was in Victoria's new office, reviewing contractor bids for their first Ford facility project, when Carol burst through the door with a look of pure panic on her normally composed face. Her usually perfect professional appearance was disheveled, her hands shaking as she clutched a legal document like it contained a death sentence. "Victoria, you need to see this immediately," Carol said, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. "It was just served by a process server, hand-delivered." She thrust the document into Victoria's hands with trembling fingers. Marcus watched Victoria's face drain of all color as she read, her lips moving silently as she processed words that seemed to hit her like physical blows. "What is it?" Marcus asked. But even as he spoke, he could see the answer in Victoria's expression, pure, unadulterated terror. Victoria's voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke. "Richard's filing for full custody of Sophie. Marcus felt the world tilt sideways, gravity seeming to shift as the implications hit him. Richard Sterling, Victoria's ex-husband, the man she divorced 2 years ago after discovering his affairs with multiple women. In all their conversations about the past, Victoria had barely mentioned him except to say the divorce had been finalized and he'd moved to California to pursue some vague business opportunities. On what grounds? Marcus demanded, moving to read over Victoria's shoulder. The answer was right there in black and white, laid out in legal language designed to destroy lives with surgical precision. Petitioner alleges that respondent has demonstrated gross negligence in child care, evidenced by minor child's recent endangerment incident, and has since formed inappropriate relationships that compromise the child's welfare and emotional stability. He knows, Victoria said numbly, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone in shock. About Sophie running away. About you. About everything. Marcus felt ice forming in his veins as the full scope of the threat became clear. Someone had been watching them, documenting their lives, building a case designed to paint Victoria as an unfit mother and him as some kind of predatory influence. The evidence was all there in the legal filing photographs of Marcus picking Sophie up from school, surveillance shots of him and Victoria working late in the new office, detailed reports of their daily routines that could only have come from weeks of professional observation. There's more, Carol said quietly, producing another document with the reluctance of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. Richards also filed complaints with Child Protective Services. They're opening a formal investigation. Victoria collapsed into her chair as if her legs had simply given out, the legal papers scattering around her like the debris of an explosion. He's going to take her away from me, she whispered, and in those words Marcus heard the sound of a mother's worst nightmare becoming reality. Marcus studied the documents more carefully, his engineer's mind automatically looking for patterns and connections, even as his heart raced with protective fury. Something was nagging at him, a sense that this wasn't just about custody or even revenge. The timing was too perfect, the evidence too comprehensive, the legal strategy too sophisticated for a man who had supposedly been absent from Sophie's life for 2 years. Victoria, he said slowly, when did your company's financial problems start the real problems, not just the cash flow issues? About 8 months ago, she said listlessly, still staring at the custody papers as if they might change if she looked at them long enough. Why does that matter? And the development deal that fell through, the one you said destroyed your cash flow and forced you to start liquidating assets? Victoria thought for a moment, her brow furrowing as she tried to focus through her panic. March, it was supposed to be a luxury residential project in Malibu. The investor pulled out at the last minute, claimed he'd found irregularities in our financial projections that weren't actually there. Marcus felt the pieces of a much larger puzzle beginning to click together with the inexorable logic of a machine designed for destruction. What was the investor's name? Pinnacle Holdings. Some investment group that Richard recommended when we were still... Victoria stopped mid-sentence, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes like a terrible sunrise. Oh my God! He's been planning this for months, Marcus said grimly, the full scope of Richard Sterling's manipulation becoming clear. Sabotaging your business, driving you toward financial ruin, documenting every moment of your struggle as evidence of your inadequacy as a parent. The brilliance of it was breathtaking in its cruelty. Richard had systematically destroyed Victoria's financial stability, isolated her from potential sources of help, and then waited for the perfect moment to present himself as the concerned father fighting to save his daughter from an unstable mother. But why? Victoria asked, her voice small and lost. He never showed any interest in Sophie during our marriage. He was absent for every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every moment that mattered. Why would he want custody now? Carol cleared her throat uncomfortably, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of information she clearly didn't want to share. There's something else. Victoria. Richard's engagement was announced in the society pages last week. He's marrying Melissa Hartwell. Victoria's face went completely white, The Hartwell family owned one of the largest media empires in the Midwest, with newspapers, television stations, and radio networks spanning from Chicago to Denver. It was a merger disguised as a marriage, the kind of power play that could launch a man with political ambitions into serious contention for statewide office. He needs to look like a devoted family man, Marcus realized, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. A loving father fighting to protect his daughter from an unstable ex-wife who's fallen in with questionable associates. He's going to use Sophie as a prop in his political ambitions, Victoria whispered, the full horror of the situation finally sinking in. Marcus felt a rage unlike anything he'd experienced since the day he'd lost his own family. This wasn't just about custody or money or even revenge. This was about a man who was willing to traumatize his own daughter and destroy the woman who loved her, all in service of his own ambitions. "Not if I can help it," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made both women look at him with surprise. Victoria's eyes filled with a different kind of fear, not just for herself and Sophie, but for him. "Marcus, if you get involved in this fight, Richard will destroy you too. You have no idea how ruthless he can be, how many powerful people owe him favors." "Neither does he," Marcus replied, and for the first time since reading the custody papers, he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. The war began in earnest the next day, fought with legal briefs instead of bullets, but no less deadly for all that. Richard's lawyers filed emergency motions to restrict Victoria's access to Sophie, pending the custody hearing, presenting carefully curated evidence of her financial instability, her questionable associations, and Sophie's recent cry for help in running away from home. They painted a picture of a mother so focused on her failing business that she'd endangered her child and then turned to a drifter mechanic with a troubled past for emotional support. The local media, undoubtedly influenced by Richard's new connections to the Hartwell media empire, picked up the story with enthusiasm. Headlines appeared across Des Moines, painting Victoria as a negligent mother who had endangered her child and then formed an inappropriate relationship with a man whose background raised serious questions about his suitability around children. The attacks were surgical in their precision, designed to destroy Victoria's reputation and credibility, while positioning Richard as the concerned father trying to save his daughter from an increasingly unstable situation. Stories appeared detailing Victoria's business failures, her company's near bankruptcy, and her pattern of poor judgment that had allegedly put Sophie at risk. But Richard Sterling had made one crucial mistake in his carefully orchestrated campaign of destruction. He'd underestimated Marcus Williams. Marcus might have spent 3 years hiding from his past, living a deliberately small life in a deliberately small town, but he hadn't forgotten how to fight, and he'd learned something in his years of grief and loss that Richard's privileged life had never taught him. When you've already lost everything that matters, you have nothing left to fear. The counterattack began with a series of phone calls to people Marcus hadn't spoken to in years, but who remembered his work, his integrity, and the debts they owed him for past favors. "Tom, it's Marcus Williams. Remember that favor you said you owed me after the emissions scandal investigation I'm ready to collect?" Tom Bradley had been Marcus's roommate at Michigan, a brilliant engineer who'd gone into federal law enforcement instead of automotive design. Now he was a senior investigator with the FBI's White-Collar Crimes Division, and he owed Marcus for information that had helped crack one of the biggest corporate fraud cases in automotive history. "Marcus, Jesus, where have you been? I heard about Sarah and Danny. Man, I'm so sorry. I'm calling about something else. Tom, I need you to look into a guy named Richard Sterling and his financial dealings over the past year. Specifically, any connection to a company called Pinnacle Holdings." "What kind of timeline are we talking about? Yesterday would be good. Tomorrow might be too late." Tom was quiet for a moment. Then, "This must be important if you're calling in that marker. Give me what you have." While Tom worked his federal contacts, Marcus made other calls to his former patent attorney, who confirmed that the hybrid propulsion system Marcus had developed was indeed still valuable enough to attract serious corporate interest. to his old boss at Ford, who was more than happy to discuss Marcus's exemplary service record and the circumstances of his departure, to character witnesses who could testify to his integrity, his stability, and his qualifications to be involved in a child's life. But the most important call was to David Chen at Tesla. Marcus, I was wondering if you'd change your mind about that patent licensing deal. Actually, David, I think I'm ready to move forward, but I need to accelerate the timeline. How quickly could you have a purchase agreement ready? For $15 million, I could have legal draw-up papers by Friday. Why the rush? Marcus looked across Victoria's office at her, watching as she tried to maintain her composure while her world crumbled around her. Because sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never saw coming. While Marcus worked his professional network, Victoria threw herself into preparing her legal defense with the desperate energy of someone fighting for her life. But despite their efforts, the preliminary custody hearing was not going well. The courtroom was packed with media and curious onlookers, drawn by the spectacle of a high-profile divorce battle that had all the elements of a perfect scandal: wealth, betrayal, child endangerment, and whispered suggestions of impropriety. Richard's legal team painted a devastating picture of Victoria as a mother so obsessed with her failing business that she'd neglected her child to the point where the girl had nearly died seeking attention. They presented psychological evaluations suggesting that Sophie was traumatized by her mother's emotional unavailability and would be better served in a stable, two-parent home with a father who had learned from his past mistakes and was ready to provide the kind of consistent, loving environment every child deserved. Marcus watched from the gallery as Victoria fought for her daughter with quiet dignity, but he could see the writing on the wall. Judge Margaret Thornton, a stern woman in her 60s with a reputation for conservative family values, was clearly being influenced by Richard's carefully constructed narrative. Then Richard took the stand himself, delivering a performance that would have earned him an Academy Award for its combination of manufactured emotion and calculated manipulation. "Your Honor," Richard said, his voice heavy with perfectly calibrated regret, "I've made terrible mistakes in my life. During my marriage to Victoria, I was absent, focused on building my career, more concerned with success than with being the husband and father my family deserved." He paused, letting a single tear track down his cheek, a tear that Marcus was certain had been practiced in front of a mirror until it achieved maximum emotional impact. "But losing my family taught me what really matters," Richard continued. "I've spent the last 2 years in therapy, working to become the man Sophie needs me to be. I've learned about priorities, about putting family first, about the kind of love and stability a child needs to thrive." It was a masterful performance, hitting every emotional note designed to appeal to a conservative judge's sensibilities about family values and redemption. Marcus could see it was working. Judge Thornton was nodding sympathetically, and Victoria's lawyer looked like a man watching his client's case circle the drain. "I'm not asking for custody out of spite or revenge," Richard said, his voice breaking just enough to seem genuine. "I'm asking for custody because I love my daughter more than my own life, and I cannot stand by and watch her be placed in situations that threaten her safety and well-being." That's when Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message that would change everything. "Found what you were looking for. Check your email. You're going to want to see this immediately. Tom." Marcus stepped out of the courtroom and opened his email on his phone. What he saw there made his blood run cold and gave him the ammunition he needed to destroy Richard Sterling completely. But first, he had one more call to make. One final piece to put in place for what would either be the most spectacular legal victory in Iowa family court history or the most catastrophic failure of his life. "Tesla Advanced Engineering. This is Jennifer. Jennifer, this is Marcus Williams. I need to speak with David Chen immediately. Tell him it's about the hybrid propulsion patent and that I'm ready to sign." The call took 15 minutes, conducted in the hallway outside the courtroom while Richard Sterling continued his Oscar-worthy performance inside. When Marcus hung up, he had a verbal commitment that would change everything if he was willing to take the biggest risk of his life. Marcus had exactly one shot at this. He thought of Sophie's trusting green eyes, of Victoria's determination to be a better mother, of the family they could become if Richard Sterling didn't destroy them all first. He walked back into the courtroom just as Richard's lawyer was beginning his closing argument, a speech designed to paint his client as a reformed man who deserved a second chance at fatherhood. "Your Honor," Marcus said, standing up in the gallery with the kind of calm authority that made everyone in the room turn to look at him. "I have information relevant to this case." Judge Thornton looked annoyed at the interruption. "Sir, you're not a party to these proceedings." "I'd like to be," Marcus said calmly, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I have evidence of fraud, conspiracy, stalking, and intentional child endangerment that this court needs to hear before making a decision that will affect Sophie Sterling's entire future." Richard spun around in his seat, his face pale beneath his perfect tan. For the first time since Marcus had known of his existence, Richard Sterling looked genuinely afraid. Judge Thornton considered for a moment, clearly torn between her desire to maintain courtroom order and her curiosity about what this confident stranger might have to say. "Approach the bench," she said finally. What happened next would become legend in Cedar Falls legal circles, talked about in coffee shops and barber shops for years to come. Marcus Williams, representing himself with nothing but righteous fury and an engineer's methodical approach to problem solving, systematically dismantled Richard Sterling's entire case with the precision of a master craftsman taking apart a flawed machine. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had commanded respect in boardrooms and engineering labs around the world. "My name is Marcus Williams. I'm a former senior design engineer at Ford Motor Company, holder of 17 patents related to hybrid and electric vehicle technology. And I'm here today because Richard Sterling's petition for custody is based on a foundation of lies, manipulation, and criminal fraud." Judge Thornton raised an eyebrow. "Those are serious accusations, Mr. Williams." "Yes, they are, and I can prove every one of them." Marcus approached the bench with the measured confidence of someone presenting a technical briefing to Ford's executive committee. From his jacket, he produced a thick folder of documents that he'd compiled over the past 48 hours with the help of his FBI contact and other professional allies. "First," he said, laying out a series of bank records and corporate filings, "Mr. Sterling has been stalking and harassing Victoria Sterling for over 8 months through a fake investment company called Pinnacle Holdings. These documents show that Mr. Sterling created this shell company specifically to sabotage Ms. Sterling's business by making fraudulent investment offers and then withdrawing them at critical moments." He placed a series of financial documents on the judge's desk. Bank records show payments from Mr. Sterling's personal accounts to private investigators who have been conducting illegal surveillance of Ms. Sterling and her daughter for months. Under Iowa law, this constitutes criminal stalking. Richard's lawyer started to object, but Marcus continued without pause. "Second, Mr. Sterling's entire case is based on the premise that Ms. Sterling is financially unstable and that I am an unemployed drifter with questionable motives for being involved in Sophie's life." Marcus smiled slightly. "As of this morning, both of those assertions are demonstrably false." He pulled out his phone and dialed a number on speaker. "Your Honor, I'd like you to speak with David Chen, Senior Vice President of Tesla Advanced Engineering." The courtroom fell silent as Chen's voice filled the space through the phone's speaker. "David, can you confirm for the court the nature of our business arrangement?" "Certainly, Marcus. Tesla has entered into an exclusive licensing agreement for Mr. Williams's hybrid propulsion system patent portfolio. The deal closed this morning for an initial payment of $15 million, with additional royalties that could reach $50 million over the next decade." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Victoria stared at Marcus with shock and wonder, while Richard looked like a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. "Furthermore," Chen continued, "Mr. Williams has informed us that he intends to use a significant portion of these proceeds to establish the Sarah and Daniel Williams Foundation for Children's Safety and Education. with Sterling Properties serving as the exclusive real estate development partner. Marcus looked directly at Richard as he continued his systematic destruction of the man's case. Your Honor, Mr. Sterling's petition alleges that I am an unemployed mechanic with no stable income or prospects, and that Ms. Sterling is financially irresponsible. As of today, I am worth approximately $15 million, and Ms. Sterling's company has just been awarded a multi-million-dollar contract that will ensure her financial stability for years to come. He turned back to Judge Thornton. But more importantly, Your Honor, I have evidence that Mr. Sterling's real motivation for seeking custody has nothing to do with love for his daughter and everything to do with his political ambitions. Marcus laid out the final set of documents emails obtained by his FBI contact from a federal investigation into campaign finance violations. These emails, obtained through a federal investigation I cannot discuss in detail, show that Mr. Ronna Sterling's engagement to Melissa Hartwell is contingent on his ability to present himself as a devoted family man. The Hartwell family has made it clear that their media empire's support for his gubernatorial campaign depends on his image rehabilitation, and custody of Sophie is a key component of that strategy. Judge Thornton read through the emails, her expression growing darker with each page. When she looked up, her voice was cold with judicial fury. Mr. Sterling, are you telling this court that you are seeking custody of your... The camera slowly pulls back from a simple kitchen window, where three figures sit around a table, golden light spilling across their faces as snow falls gently outside. In the end, it wasn't money that saved them. It wasn't power or influence or the machinery of justice. It was something much simpler and infinitely more rare. Cut to Marcus's weathered hands teaching Sophie to use a wrench, Victoria's laughter echoing through a modest home that finally feels like one. Marcus Williams came to Cedar Falls carrying the weight of unimaginable loss, believing his story was over. He found a little girl who had given up hope of being wanted, and a mother who had forgotten how to love without conditions. The camera settles on a framed photo, three people who chose to become a family. They discovered that sometimes the most broken people are the ones best equipped to heal others. That courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing love when fear seems safer. That home isn't a place you inherit or purchase. It's something you build, one choice at a time, with people brave enough to believe in second chances. Fade to black as soft piano music swells. In a world that often feels cold and unforgiving, their story reminds us of a simple truth: we're never too lost to be found, never too broken to heal, never too alone to belong. What would you risk everything for?